So I'm honored to be here to talk about my project. Now, this is just one facet of the complete scope of research I've done so far. There's so much more, and it's killing me not to be able to talk about all of it here, but I will do my best. I'm hoping to have a publication ready by the end of August, but we'll see if that's overambitious. So I'm here to talk about Caroline Earle White, who's an absolutely fascinating woman. She was born in Philadelphia in 1833. And she would speak of, even as a child in busy Penn Square, she wouldn't walk down there because she would watch the people and they would beat and overload their horses or their mules, and she just didn't have the heart to look at that. She was child of adamant Quakers, and as if you're familiar with the Quakers, they were responsible for a lot of reform movements through the 18th and 19th century. While she was involved in a lot of charity groups, in 1867, in her early 30s, she would become one of the first 3 people to establish humane societies in the United States, and the only woman to do so. Unfortunately, as a woman, she wasn't able to run the organization, so she founded the women's branch of the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which takes forever to say, so now they call it the Women's Humane Society. Over the years, she would be responsible for the installation of watering stations throughout Philadelphia, some of which still stand today. I have some pictures of it at the end. But some of the things that people don't think about, I mean, she did work on about stray animals. She's very aware of the fact that laboratories would steal people's pets to experiment on them. She was behind finding a lot of that. I mean, they actually had ads in the newspaper that would pay people 50 cents or $1 for cats and dogs, and people would have them go missing. But it was, so for example, with something closer to now, 1871, she played an integral part in getting the 28-hour law passed. And this was very concerned with the suffering of animals destined for food consumption. And if you're familiar with legislation going on with ag-gag, and the concerns about the abuses in factory farming. She was really a big advocate of that. She went personally to Congress to lobby for it and was essential in helping get that passed. However, no cause which she was associated with would garner so much opposition as the American Anti-Vivisection Society. And just to answer some questions now, the society was not based on absolute abolition of vivisection. What it was based on was the regulation and transparency of the processes and, using painkillers and things. She just wanted to ensure that that stuff wasn't hidden. As you can understand with pets going missing and situations like that, she just wanted to prevent that from happening. Where I'm going to focus on here is just some of the things that she would have had to deal with as a woman and an advocate for the voice of the voiceless. And that's not just voiceless as animals, but underrepresented or minorities or just people with no power. One of the things she was concerned about was that the experimentation would move on to the poor and the insane. And if you know your history there too, that is actually what happened in some cases. And Philadelphia was, let me move to this slide. The Philadelphia Physician Factory was infamous in the 19th century. It was the center of worldwide. This was published in England. Many men were implicated for selling medical degrees. Medicine was like easier. People went into it because it was easier than going into business at this time. And a number of schools were closed, and there was a big drama about that. So England kind of poked their fun at that. However, misogyny runs rife through the histories of some of these movements as well. It was the time of the book The Yellow Wallpaper, which was a book, there's some debate on whether it was based on the actual rest cure, but the rest cure was a real thing implemented by the respected physician S. Ware Mitchell, where hysteria and other women's problems were treated by basically locking a woman up in a room, isolating her from everyone. She couldn't even turn herself over. Nurses would turn her over. She'd get fed ale or beef, and they would actually have fish oil enemas at least once a week. But he believed that women were biologically inferior, and this is what he had to do. He says, well, I tried this on drifters and people who didn't want to work, so I think I'll try it on women. Okay, maybe that wasn't exactly how he said it, but that is where it came from. He publicly challenged her when he demanded more or less, I want the animals from your pound. And given that her organization was anti-cruelty and humane society, she refused to do it. He questioned her authority. He says, well, you're a woman. Did you check with your board? Legally, and the board all agreed with her, but he was one of the first people to put the idea forward that she cared more about animals than people, when it was absolutely not the case. She did work for all life. Little more about S. Ware Mitchell. There's so many other people I could talk about, but one of the quotes in a tribute to him, he stated, "The women's desire to be on a level of competition with man and to assume his duties, I am sure, is making mischief. This is science, wisdom, and of course, therefore, truth." And I think that in the early, we don't have the ethical considerations that science does today, and you could just say, well, this is science, it's truth, so therefore I'm right. His belief was that teenage girls should not study for more than 3 to 4 hours a day. The rest of the time should be exercising and preparing for her future duties as a childbearer. And it's sort of reminiscent of later pictures of during like the 1930s in Germany and the idea of the fit mother kind of image. And this shouldn't be particularly surprising, as eugenics really, we think of, well, many people think of it as something that they associate with World War II, but it really started, a lot of it got a good, healthy start in the United States. As a side note, Dr. Alexis Carrel, who was basically more or less exiled from practicing in France via opinion, would come to the Rockefeller organization in New York, and he would earn his Nobel Prize, although a number of scientists questioned his findings. But he was an open advocate for eugenics, and he actually approved a passage on eugenics in textbooks in the US and in Europe. Women didn't have an easy time getting into medicine as it was. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell had to go to Geneva to earn her degree, and when she came back, she tried to open doors for female doctors here. It was a very contentious thing, with the Contagious Disease Act having recently been thrown out of Europe because women could be subjected to humiliating inspections at just the slightest suspicion of disease. She was really an advocate of, a woman shouldn't have to be seen by a male doctor. And she said later that she told another doctor that if the female doctors of the medical profession in the United States did not move more strongly against vivisection, she should, and I quote, never be able to forgive them, and should be almost sorry she had ever done anything to open the way for them into the profession. Touching on another thing that's been touched a little bit, now this is actually a good spot, addressed in The Old Brown Dog, which is a reference in the title, was a book by Coral Lansbury, who studied the anti-vivisection movement in England. And so I kind of wanted to run off with it, how it splintered into the US. But one of the things they address is that there was even a sexuality associated with vivisection or dissection, and the fact that women weren't allowed to practice it. But as you can see in this picture, and this is actually a very famous painting, it sold for a lot of money, it's by Thomas Eakins. But one thing that they address, some of the researchers address, is with easy access to women's bodies, surgeons became an obvious target as characters in scenarios of illicit sexuality. For example, the amatory experience of a surgeon would focus on a surgeon who stated that medical men like himself are not ignorant of the secret pangs and unruly desires which consume the bashful virgin. Pornographer Edward Ashby claimed his compilations of the list of these prohibited books were scientific, and as you can see on this quote here, these researchers aren't stretching much in drawing this conclusion, because as it is my belief, my book will excite the passions of my readers, as would the naked body of a woman extended on the dissecting table produce concupiscence in the minds of the students assembled to witness an operation performed about her. And this painting was actually controversial for that reason. There's a woman there and surrounded by all these men, and it was very addressing the medical gaze. One other thing that I found really fascinating that Caroline Earle White commented, and this would be in the Journal of Zoophilia, which was her central piece for the Anti-Vivisection Society, but she also wrote to editors, and she did so much other work, which I can't talk about yet. So talking about the number of murders during this period of time, Jack the Ripper being the most famous, probably just everybody in the room, but in this short period of time, we had a number of murders with doctors murdering either young women or their wives, and I'm not saying that it was specifically always men murdering women this way, but there was definitely, everybody read the same news. When you consistently see this keep coming up, she kind of asked, well, how is this happening? So, and again, like I mentioned, I didn't mention this a little bit earlier, but to get back to the point of, so you're looking at what these doctors are doing, and you say, well, where's this suspicion coming from? But it wasn't that long ago that in Philadelphia, kind of tied into the scandal with the physician factory, is that these students were robbing graveyards for bodies, and they were digging up bodies of minorities, in particular African Americans. And when they came to protest, the students were basically singing racial slurs and threatening violence to the people who were protesting. So in wrapping up, although Nathaniel Hawthorne considered female writers scribbling women, White opened her first novel, Love in the Tropics, in 1890, stating that she hoped that she could at least bring home to the minds of my readers what I believe to be certain truth, that a warm heart, as noble nature, and as bright an intellect may be found under a yellow or brown or black skin as under a white one. She cared not only for animals, but for all of the helpless or vulnerable. As the medical profession organized and the idea of inhumane humanitarianism emerged hand in hand with concepts like social Darwinism, White's warnings against the next step, as you can see here, I hope it's kind of faded, went unchecked. And we would see, even through very recent history, that experimentation did continue on children, minorities, and ultimately culminating in situations like the Holocaust and the Tuskegee Airmen experiments. So I think that although the historical record doesn't have a book for her yet, that's my plan, and I hope that this has been informative for you. Oh, and there's the fountain. So then and now.
All right, and we do have time for the questions.
I'm interested in the sort of the coverage of this. Obviously, there's just a lot of material here. It's hard to know what to respond to. There's so much, and it's so interesting. But the coverage in the newspaper that you had, that list of bullet points.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if it's more murders per se, or if it's more fascination with women's bodies and medicine, and that, you know, the kind of access that medicine's having, because certainly previously, right, you have women taking care of women, midwives and so forth, right? And now we have the medical profession that is just stepping in. Right. Certainly this is happening in Europe as well, in England, right? This is where men and the worked out physicians actually begin to step into medical care and claiming, you know, gynecology and obstetrics and so forth as their purview. Previously had been handled in more you know, basically women's networks, essentially, specialization. So can you address that at all? What's happening here with medicine and the fascination here with that, you know, the misogyny certainly comes out, but there's also kind of this kind of larger context.
All right, let me see if I can.
I mean, can you say more about that? I mean, is it really more murder, or is it more fascination as men? I mean, are women really being murdered at a higher rate, or is this more of a fascination, the kind of eroticization?
There's certainly a case for that. There's certainly a case that it could be mentioned more often because people are interested in it, especially in the cases of poisoning. But in some of the cases, which I don't have time to get into the details, the bodies were found. You know, one of the big controversies about the Jack the Ripper was that he was definitely a surgeon, and that many of these were either one of them, Carrie, was interviewed later before his execution saying that he thought vivisection was beautiful and talked all about it, and you know, his victim was found taken apart. And I don't think Caroline Earle White was definitely different than her equivalent in England, who's Frances Power Cobb. Frances Power Cobb was very much more focused on the feminist aspect. Caroline Earle White really didn't. She wasn't anti-feminist by any means, but she was more focused in a more general way in protecting people. I mean, there was certainly a fascination, and there's no doubt that, especially if the pornography was, you know, putting forth this idea. I mean, there's just like endless examples of these, you know, experiences of a surgeon where they would have all these scenes. And then you have other factors coming in, like Poe kind of had this like cult of the dead woman, how beautiful the dead woman was. So yeah, I mean, I think culturally it was probably coming out. But, you know, the fact is that it was still happening. So I have another book that I'd like to probably look up again on that. Is specifically called Death in the City. It was on Philadelphia. I didn't see any direct correlations there, but again, some crimes just didn't get reported, so that's kind of a whole.
Right.
I mean, it's just one aspect of it that she kind of brought up, and there's so many things she brought up that.
What an interesting life and career.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
What an interesting life and career she
Oh,
had.
yeah. Like I said, I really need to have it done by the end of August because I had to put it aside for my work this term. But I am definitely visited with people from Temple University Archives and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania who have some of her stuff. And there's thousands and thousands of pages of the Journal of Zoophilia. And the things I've discovered about some of her opponents as well are just mind-blowing. So, but the one point I like to make for people was just the fascination of, she wrote this book called Love in the Tropics, and I love comparing it against H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, because it's definitely the question of vivisection and the question of, she was much more benevolent towards humanity than Wells was.
What is Love in the Tropics about?
Well, it's kind of a general, it's a speculative kind of fiction. It's like a very early kind of science fiction, like it had a man-eating plant in it, but it was a story about getting shipwrecked, very much like Island of Dr. Moreau, but her view of the indigenous people was very positive. And if you go, it's like it's a fascinating look at the way the two narratives go, and just how they viewed people should be. And yeah, it's kind of an adventure romance kind of book. I mean, not heavily like we would think of romance now, but it is there. Thank you.